So I'm just going to cover the process I run through at the beginning of each month for creating the NSAS annual smoke alarm work orders. So the information you need for this is on the S drive under the Agent Plus IT and then NSAS create work orders folder. I've put a high level summary in a Word doc which is in this folder that basically just goes through saying we need to create these annual smoke alarm work orders when they become due on the properties or for new properties that we've just taken over the management of. We generate the work orders when the previous test that was performed was 10 months ago or more, or there's no previous test for a property, and that way it sweeps up the new properties into the process as well. We only use NSAS in Victoria and New South Wales. Queensland use a different supplier and a different process. Trish Tebb is the main business contact with NSAS, and she also has a good understanding of this process with Jeff as a backup. So the high level steps I'll talk through first and then I'll actually go through them. First one is we update the last test date, which is on the property form, from the NSAS invoice batches that they send us. So basically once a month they send us an invoice batch via FTP. So it's a whole lot of individual PDFs and then an index file or a CSV file that automatically loads into DPS. So that process is all automatic and happens, and the invoices get loaded, but it contains an extra column of the last test date, which is actually when the test was performed, which is very different to the invoice date. I'll see if I can get Greg George to actually process that last test date as part of the DPS process, but until that happens, it's a manual step. Once that's done and we've updated all of the last known test dates for the properties based on all the invoices we've received at the end of the month, we then run an SQL script that goes through and identifies all those properties that fall due, and will then create the details in a table called EXT-WO create, which is then used to trigger off a process. So that table is linked to a remedy view form called RPM VF WO create. So you open that up in Remedy, you do a search for all of the rows you've just inserted, and that's where the processed field is set to null currently, and then you do a modify all and you set that process field to X, which triggers the create of the actual work orders in the system. And once that's all done and all those work orders are created, you then open the most recent spreadsheet from the previous month of the work orders, which is in that S drive folder where all the other info is. You do a refresh of that spreadsheet and it'll pull in all of the new work orders and also a summary of all open work orders on the second tab. Once you've done that, save it as the current month and then send it off to David Maguire at NSAS. He's the owner of NSAS, and CC Trish Tebb so she knows about that. So I'll just go through the process now. So we'll go to where those files are. So NSAS pretty much send us a file once a month. They say they try and do it every 2 weeks, but it's almost once a month and usually right at the end of the month. So you'll see the last two. We got one on the 2nd of the 3rd, so it was actually just into the beginning of March, so actually missed the process last month, and one that was came through last night. So our process looks for them in the morning. They're usually sent the night before, but at 8 a.m, the process that sweeps these up and loads them into the automatic folder is when that runs. So I've got 2 months to do because we didn't have the file on the 1st of March last month that came through on the 2nd. So I just need to get the CSVs out of these zip files. So I'll just open them with 7-zip. It's a lot quicker than opening them with Word. And then I just go to the bottom and find the CSV file, and I just drag that into the folder. And then I'll do the same. Do the same for the most recent one. So again, open it with 7-zip. drag the CSV out of there. Close that down. So now in this folder, I've got those two most recent CSVs. So it's that one and that one. So I'll just open both of those in Excel. And you'll see these basically have the required format to load it in. And it's got the invoice date, the due date, and then here's the inspection date. So that's actually the date when it was performed. So you can see this one was back in January, but they didn't create the invoice until the end of February. So there can be a bit of a delay. And that's just the second folder. And then what I do is in that same folder, you'll see the Excel spreadsheet when I last did it. So I just create this file, NSAS update, last inspected. And you can see I last did it at the end of Jan. So there's no file in March. So from here, you can just see all I really keep is the work order number, the inspected date, the document file name, which is just for reference, and then the property. No, that's a lookup actually. So all I need to do is go back to the spreadsheet and I get rid of these columns and I keep the work order. So I delete those columns. I don't need the invoice number. I need the inspected date. So delete those columns and delete that. So what I keep is the work order ID, the inspected date, and the document file. I'll do that on the other folder as well. So I want work order ID, inspected date, and document file name. Okay, so I'll go back to this file now. I'll delete the data I've got in here. I won't delete the lookups because I'll use those. So I'll delete the previous data. And then I'll copy the information from here. So just copy and paste, and the VLOOKUPs start working. I'll go to the end of the spreadsheet. Now I'll paste in the February ones from here. Paste those. So you see it's actually looking up the property ID from the work order. Now some of those work orders might have been created since this was last updated. So on this second tab is where I've got the property lookup. So it's just a list of all of the work orders for NSAS and what property ID is associated with that work order. So I just need to do a refresh all to get that data out of Agent Plus. So now I've got all that current info, and now when I go back to here, it should have found all of those properties. I just eyeball it because sometimes they actually put the work order, the wrong work order in the data file, so it doesn't match up. The data entry guys will fix it when they go through. I think I saw it, there's one. So that work order doesn't actually exist. So they've typically done a typo in the work order number, which is why I've got the document file there. I actually open the document, eyeball it, look at the address of the property, and then work out what the work order was probably supposed to be. So that's the only one that's wrong. So I'll just go back and find that again. Yeah, look, I won't bother at this stage. I'll just leave that one out when I do the update. So what this does is then create a SQL statement to update on the property, the last test date to be the inspection date that's from the spreadsheet here for that property ID. So I'll just sort this so that they're not applicables at the bottom. I'll copy, whoops, wrong button. Copy that column, and then I'll go across. Now, probably need to be sure they're not running a sweep at the time, because you're going to do an update to quite a few property records, or you could do it in chunks, but there's, what is there here? Just over 1,000 properties that are going to get updated. Okay, so I'll run that. All done. So I don't need to save that. Okay, so just going back to the Word document, I've done the first step here, which is to update the last test date from the NSAS invoices. So just as an example, actually I'll save this. So I'll do a file save as of my Excel spreadsheet and just up to the current date. So 401. And if I were to pick this property, that property ID, I'll go into Agent Plus. So the last inspection date you can see there is the 2nd of Feb 2015. If I open that property, and I think it's under Assets and Insurance, you'll see it's updated. The last test is on the 2nd of the 2nd. Okay, so that now going back to the Word doc. The next step is to run the SQL to generate these work orders. So again, that the SQL for it is in the same folder. So it's in this folder here, that's the SQL, which I have open. Now I've actually got the code that does a create commented out just for safety, so I'll just walk through this briefly. So I've said this, you do this after updating the last test date from the NSAS invoice CSV run, and that process will then, this process in this file will create it. So it creates a temporary file, a temporary table, sorry, with the most recent NSAS work order per property. Now it does it as a temporary table because if you try to do it with the join using this function that I've got here, the process takes forever. So I'll just do this first step at the moment. It'll drop the current temporary table and it'll just create the new one. Sorry, I'm on the Wi-Fi, so it's got to reconnect. Okay, so it's just created 2,864 rows, and it's qualified for just those properties where it's 10 months since their last test. So they're the only ones that I need to know about. And this select statement then just joins to that for information. So it's just a check what result did I get, and it will show you all the properties that now have that last test date booked, or you'll see some nulls here as well. Which is the first time. So their last test date was booked in December 2014, more than 10 months ago. Therefore, it's going through. Now, I've just made a comment there. This step is commented out for safety. So this actually sets those properties with the last test booked to today, which is a different thing. If I still got that property open in Agent Plus, no. So I'll open that property again, and I'll just show you what I'm talking about. So again, on the Assets and Insurance tab, this is the last time we booked a test. So that's when we last created a work order for NSAS. So the last work order was created, or the test booked, on the 30th of the 10th 2014, and that test was actually performed in February. So you can see there was quite a lag between when we sent the work order to NSAS and when they performed the test. So we don't do the work orders based on 12 months since the last work order. We do the work order based on 12 months since the last test was done at the property. So we're about to create the work order bookings today for all those that meet the criteria and fall due. So I'm about to update this date to today on those properties. So that's what this step here does. Done, 1024. And then if I do this select, and again I can just do it as a test, I've commented out the insert for safety. So I can just run the query first before I insert it into the work order create table. And I get 1024 there, so that's all right. So now what I do is just grab it without the comment, and I'll actually now do it with the insert. Okay, so I've now inserted those rows into the work order create table. There's a comment here just to remind you, on the work order create form in RPM, set the process to X, which is the same comment. So now I go to process these new rows in the RPM work order create form and do a search for them. So if I go into remedy, that's what I had open. So RPM VF work order create is the form we need. I'll just do the search, which I've got in the document. So I'm just searching for all of the records here where they haven't been processed yet. So in that case, the processed field is null. So I'll search for that, and we should get 1024 if all goes well, which we do. So now we select all of those, do a modify all, set process to X, which then triggers the creation of the work orders. I'll pause the video at this stage just because it takes a bit of a while. Okay, that's just finished. So if we actually go back to that property now, I'll close it down, open it again. We'll see two things, sorry, on the assets and insurance. So we've now got I would have expected that to update. Maybe it wasn't in our list. Let me just see under the jobs. I need to look at that as to why that one's not in the list. Ah, of course it's not, because it was just one of the ones we updated to say that it's just been tested. Silly me. Anyway, that makes sense. So if we go back to the workers, okay, so now we just need to update the spreadsheet that we send to NSAS with all these work order details. So if we go into the directory, you'll see there's a work order tenant contact details, so that NSAS can get in contact with the tenants to organise access and so forth. So we'll open that spreadsheet. Then we just need to do a refresh all. There's two tabs here. One is the new work orders that were just created today, and the second tab is all open work orders, so all those are still waiting to be completed. So I'll do a file save as today's date. 0401. And from here, I'll be able to look at one of those properties. So if I look at that property ID here and go into Agent Plus, now I'll see that last test booked is the 1st to the 4th, and if you look at the jobs, there's the work order that was just created. So annual work and smoke alarm test, and that's in the spreadsheet that we send off to David Maguire. Any questions? Trish can probably help try and clarify, but that should be all you need to know.